Well, hello and good morning. I'm Leonardo McClarty, and I'm president of the Howard County Chamber, and here with Policy Matters with Delegate Courtney Watson and my co-host Josh Bokee from Comcast. And so, once again, we're excited to have everyone to join us and look forward to having another conversation on activities taking place during the General Assembly session. And so, I'm sure that with our guest today, she's certainly someone that is no stranger to Howard County, but for those that may be new, just a little bit about Delegate Watson. She has truly served this community for a number of years. I'll just leave it at that. And so, having been on the Board of Education, the County Council, and now in Annapolis as part of our General Assembly, and who knows where we'll see her from there. But Delegate Watson, thank you for joining us. And also, I meant to mention as well, she serves on the Economic Matters Committee. And so that is one committee that particularly from a chamber perspective, we've followed and always seemingly each session, at least since maybe the 7 years or 6 years I've been here, we've always ended up following closely. And so we'll talk about different things taking place there. But Delegate Watson, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here with the chamber, and I look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. And Josh, anything you'd like to add this morning?
No, I'd just say thank you, Leonardo, and good morning, Delegate Watson. On behalf of Comcast, it's great to be here. And, during the pandemic, I will say our priority has been to continue to connect our communities and our customers. And that's one of the great things I think about this morning with Policy Matters is that we're now connecting our elected officials with the community on some really great discussion. So, Leonardo, let's take it away.
Excellent. And so I guess the first thing really, this has obviously been a unique legislative session. And so from your perspective, just how do you think things are progressing in terms of obviously we're meeting a lot using platforms like this, particularly virtual and over camera. And so just how do you feel that the session is progressing thus far?
I think we're getting a tremendous amount of work done. The switch to virtual has had its challenges, but in general, it's been pretty seamless. And we are conducting our hearings and testimony and meeting with advocates all virtually. Now, the Senate has been from the beginning a little bit more in person because it was easier to accommodate the fewer numbers of senators as it was compared to 141 delegates. And so in the House of Delegates, we do all of our committee work virtually, including voting and public hearings, but we are on the floor for voting sessions, but we're split into two rooms, the House floor and the annex, they call it. And I happen to be on the House floor, so it's been pretty seamless, all things considered. And the main thing we were worried about, I think, was access, public access, advocates that wanted to talk to us about certain bills, the chamber, we're used to meeting with you in person, but we have been able to accommodate, I think, for the most part, everyone who's wanted to meet with us has just been virtually.
And so how has it been in terms of, I guess, when it comes to those, few times where you've had floor votes and you're in different rooms and I guess kind of describe, how does the discussion or perhaps debate take place with you guys split?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've had some very serious long debates. Most recently on Friday, we had a couple of bills that we were debating. And there is communication between speaker staff, between the annex and the floor. And so when someone wants to ask a question in the annex, they notify that staff person, and basically they get in a queue, and that staff person lets the speaker know on the floor, and she is able to go back and forth. They broadcast the questions from the annex on the floor, and the person who's asking a question in the annex is in like a telephone booth, and they clean it in between each person using it. But it's pretty seamless because they are asking questions of the floor, and the floor leader, who is located in the main building, is communicating back and forth with the person asking the question in the annex, and it's all visualized on the screen for both sides. So it has worked pretty well for the most part. You know, sometimes somebody will want to ask a question and it doesn't happen in time because of the time it takes to transfer it back and forth, but that's only happened a couple of times and on nothing that critical. And they've been working on reducing that and making that, trying to pause longer in between changing topics.
Interesting. Sounds like it would actually be some, I guess, like a good field trip or something good to live stream in and just see it all at work.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the key is the speaker staff is doing an amazing job. Alex Hughes, Jeremy Baker, they're all really, the logistics of it are pretty amazing, but seeing it from the outside, you don't realize how much work it actually takes to make it look so easy.
Well, no, and I can imagine, because I know different things that we've done here at the Chamber, and, you know, even just last week with the State of Business Address and having to run through that and you know, different things when you start going through your, and in our case, even just from an event standpoint, I run a show and you start your scripting of someone that's controlling screens and what comes up and what goes out, and allowing those moments to pause so that things can take place, because sometimes the share doesn't happen quite as fast as you think it is, and so forth. So I can only imagine. So for yourself this session, what have been, just as you were thinking about, you know, the session, what was going to be some of your priorities, whether there were bills you introduced or things that you wanted to see get done or accomplished?
Well, thank you for that question. For me, trying to support small business, particularly with our COVID package, our COVID relief package, that was critically important. And also fixing unemployment insurance. Both of those things fall under my committee, Economic Matters. And so we are working, we've already passed a COVID relief package, which will release funding to different areas that will help the overall state, whether it's local government or business. That is going to be a big help. But in addition to that, we have a bill before our committee right now. It's actually in work session to help the hospitality industry. Many of our small businesses are in hospitality, restaurants, caterers, bars and taverns, and they have really been impacted by COVID. And the governor had an executive order to allow these businesses to provide carry-out alcohol, and that is going to expire. So what we've done is I put a bill together to permit restaurants to provide carry-out alcohol with certain guardrails in place until 11 p.m. at night with prepared food only, obviously being 21 and older. And that should help provide another avenue of profit making for restaurants to help them stay viable. And hang on one second while I let the dog out.
Oh, you gotta love this. I have my dog in the crate because my wife had to go to the front.
Well, I didn't have him in here. But then somebody opened the door and let him in right in the middle of the conversation.
That's become routine now during pandemic, right? We all have dogs and kids.
You know what?
Just expect
Josh, it really, so much so that that Zoom actually has a feature when you go into your settings, you can actually turn noise reduction, and they have an auto setting, and then they have a high setting, and the high setting literally has in there, it has parentheses, dogs barking, fingers typing. And so I think it's just one of those that we all have had to just become accustomed to and adjust it. So just have one more question, actually, speaking of kind of COVID and so forth, before I turn it over to Josh, and kind of almost shifting, still COVID related, but not so much from a relief standpoint, but as it relates to education, and obviously something that I know you're passionate about. And I know that, for instance, you know, Dr. Moderato and I have talked, and one of the bills, I guess, that he's following or interested in pertains to the school systems being able to move towards a virtual learning model, say when we get back to the more traditional setting, and kids are in school, but when we get, say, for instance, like 2 weeks ago, and we have these massive snows, they can then go to a virtual learning setting as opposed to having to just have a missed day of school. And your thoughts there, and I guess I don't know if you followed that legislation. I'm not sure where it's going in terms of committees, but just maybe your thoughts there.
About school and virtual learning and going back to school?
Well, so basically this bill particularly would allow school systems to be able, in days where you have inclement weather, as opposed to just canceling school, they can basically say, look, the same way they send notes out saying we're on a 2-hour delay or school is canceled, they'd send a note saying, hey, we're going to shift now to, virtual learning. And thus, I think the concept and idea behind it is that, one, you don't lose a day, and two, when it gets so tough, when you start factoring in all of the different, whether it's religious holidays and the teacher training days and everything else, it gets tough as you get, in that second half of the year, trying to figure out how do we make these days up without, taking other stuff.
Well, I think that's going to be very popular with the parents and not very popular with the kids. So, everybody loves a snow day, but the reality is if we could use those days for instruction, it would first of all, make the year a lot more predictable for teachers and staff and students and parents, but also continue the learning with the kids. And I may not always be able to do that. For example, if you've had instances in the past where you've had widespread power outages and we wouldn't be able to do it then. But I think it's a good idea. I'm not sure it's a good idea for a 1-hour delay or a 2-hour delay. But I think if you really had to be out for 1 day or 2 day or 3 days, that virtual learning would be a smart thing for us to incorporate.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when he mentioned that the General Assembly would have to approve it. And I know I've watched it from, I have a number of friends, still back, where I grew up in Georgia, and that have commented about when they've had inclement weather, how they've been able to go. And I've seen them post on either Twitter or Facebook, kids are doing remote learning. And I was like, wow, that's a pretty cool concept that kind of takes advantage of the technology so you don't lose. It's a little bit long overdue. So that's certainly one of the silver linings in the pandemic. Yeah. So Josh?
Yeah, Delegate Watson, it's interesting, right? When you think about with the pandemic and you think about issues prior to the pandemic that might have seemed somewhat insurmountable, whether it's a micro issue like permitting for restaurants to do sidewalk cafes or much larger complex issues. And it seems right with the pandemic, there's been a number of things that may have been, more challenging to do, but now suddenly we're able to do that. How has, as you think about this now over the past year, how has your own thinking, evolved perhaps about what may have been possible in terms of from policy issues as you entered into the State House, and as you go post-pandemic, what you see could be possible going forward? So do things that may have been seen perhaps more insurmountable to get consensus on seem more possible now afterwards?
I think from a technology standpoint, we've all had our eyes open to how we can make the State House more accessible. So I think that is something we will try to keep as we go forward, although we will go back to meeting in session, we will go back to voting in session and having public hearings. But in my view, why make somebody from Garrett County drive all the way to Annapolis to testify if they could just testify online? So I think that has been a positive. In terms of working together, I don't really see any impact, between the across the aisle. I think we're still working together the same way we did before the pandemic. So I don't think that has really been impacted. I think it's hard to communicate with each other like we used to. So that's been a downside. We don't see each other in the hallways as much. In the coffee break room, if we want to check in and say, hey, what do you think about this bill? That's really suffered, and we don't do that. We have to be very intentional when we want to do that. And so sometimes it doesn't happen. So I think the exchange of ideas is probably a a little bit less than it would be otherwise. You had a pretty big, broad question, so I'm not sure if I answered it exactly the way you intended, but those are my thoughts.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It was meant to kind of take it any direction that you wanted to.
Good.
No, and I know from talking to my colleagues in particularly on the Eastern Shore at the chambers down there, as well as the Garrett County, I think that has probably been something that has been appreciated this year actually from them, because to your point, they end up driving easily 3 hours or so and spend
Right.
many nights in Annapolis, just because it just doesn't make sense to drive that far for 3 minutes and
Right.
then have to turn around and drive back, which I think gets to another topic that's been of interest, I guess, interest for us in following. I think in terms of just that participation piece, and then we'll kind of dig in a little bit more into some of the things from your committee's perspective, has been, on the one hand, I think the accessibility has picked up, certainly with the technology and so forth. But probably if there's been, I guess, I don't know if a downside is the right word, but it's the fact that at least when you came to testifying at some of these hearings, pretty much if you signed up, you at some point you got a chance to
Yes.
speak. Whereas
Yes.
now, a lot of times the different committee chairs are only having, give or take, 4 or 5 people for or against an issue to be able to testify. And so,
Right.
and you've got this kind of hard stop in the sense that, oh, you've got a window between 10 and 3. You've got to get that
Right.
testimony uploaded. Otherwise, you miss out. And at least from the standpoint of having it a part of a hearing, you can obviously
Right.
reach out to your elected officials and so forth.
So that's been quite an adjustment, I think, for people who come to testify. I think they recently expanded the hours that you could upload the testimony from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., 2 days before the hearing. And now that people are used to that, those who are used to testifying a lot now have fallen into the routine, but people who maybe only do it once or twice a year are still struggling with that. In our committee, we don't limit the number of people testifying except for the overall House limit, which I think is 50. And I know that in other committees, they do limit it, but in our committee, our chairman has always provided as much time as possible, as long as the delegates still want to continue to ask questions, and there is no limit on the number of people that can testify in economic matters.
And obviously your committee, speaking of which, is the one that seems like each year gets the I guess the more I guess in some respects the volatile, or at least the ones where some of the bills that people tend to be most passionate about.
Yeah, we get our share for sure. Yes, we do.
Yeah. And so this year, I mean, just to allow some of our viewers to know some, so obviously we've got, and the delegates mentioned, the fact of, the different bills coming through, but you've got, besides labor related, you've got, for instance, corporate board diversity related legislation that comes through. You've got different equity, you've got workers protection, almost, I guess, anything that has to deal with perhaps, I guess, the employer-employee relationship, I guess, ultimately comes through the economic matters.
Business and I guess regulations, employer-employer regulations, business regulations, utilities, financial institutions, insurance, energy, all of those things come through. And we've had a lot in the area of, I guess you would call it, employee benefits. And one of the bills I think you all have asked about is House Bill 581, the Maryland Essential Workers Act. And that is a bill that was very comprehensive. It was introduced by our chairman, and it basically sought to give additional benefits to essential workers in times of emergency. And I think the intent of that bill was to protect essential workers. I mean, we haven't had this kind of emergency in our lifetime. And so we were not prepared for it, I think, overall as a country. But I believe that, people have stepped up, and we've tried to plug the holes and support people through various relief bills at the federal and state level. But there was concern about essential workers in the private sector. And so that's where this bill originated. So the intent is to assist essential workers by providing the right kinds of personal protective equipment, by giving them hazard pay, basically, which amounted in the bill to $3 more an hour. It is a bill that has generated a lot of criticism and then also a lot of advocacy. And the way the chairman has decided to handle it is to put together a work group with members from the Senate, members from the House, and then members from many of the industries affected, not all of them. They had their first work group meeting on Thursday, where they agreed to limit the definition of emergency to a catastrophic public health emergency. And in the next meeting, they're going to talk about the scope of the bill and definition of industries and sectors to be covered. But the general consensus from that work group meeting was that the bill was too broad. So we're going to go into a second work group meeting probably this week, and they will continue to work on it. I think the important thing to keep in mind is all of these bills have a fiscal note. And this one in particular has a very large fiscal note, not just for the private sector, but for state government. So for state agencies, this bill would cost $26.1 million. And that in and of itself means that the bill probably won't succeed unless it is very heavily amended. So that's what we're dealing with now on that bill, and we will see where the work group goes and keep monitoring it.
You know, I think there's so much that you mentioned there for those that perhaps don't maybe follow this stuff as closely as at times Josh and myself, and that is the fact that I think sometimes, you know, you've got this situation of intent, and I think at different times, you know, regardless as to perhaps whether you're private industry, public, or employer, employee, Democrat, Republican, I think a lot of times you can probably agree on the intent, and
Right.
then it gets into the actual weeds of what does the legislation say. And so I think sometimes for people, when they see the chamber, as an example, taking a position on a certain bill, they say, oh my gosh, how could you be taking that issue? Well, it's not so much on the concept, it's what is in the actual legislation. And I think this was one where I know, you know, we had an opportunity to talk, and even as we've spoken in kind of our industry groups, when you speak about the broadness of it, it's been one of those where you say, okay, well, gosh, where do we start? Because sometimes you end up saying, okay, you know, there may be 5 things, and you say, okay, we don't like 3 of them, but 2 of them we can live with. And so let's perhaps work on the 3 we don't like or whatever. But this was one that it was just so many different things that you ended up having interested parties say, okay, we've got to have some kind of work group because we don't even know where to start. And I think this is also probably a rare instance where you've got public sector, private sector alike being impacted, and really you could even add a third if you wanted to call it not-for-profit institution,
Sure.
what have you. But pretty much if you were an employer, you stood to be impacted in some form or fashion. And so good to hear at least kind of the update. I knew there was a work group that had been put together and some of the representatives. And the one thing I certainly will just add and say that it's been great for Howard County, for those, again, that don't know, and having you on this particular committee, because I think in many respects, because of what you do in your day-to-day livelihood, there's so many things that really correlate to where you can actually really see it in many respects kind of from an employer, you know, perspective, to at least try to provide some balance where, you know, I don't know how they determine what committees you get on, but I know sometimes you could end up being on the energy committee where you would have perhaps had a much longer ramp up period in terms of perhaps getting up to speed on some of the issues and so forth.
I mean, it's incredibly valuable to have a private sector background for me, being on the Economic Matters Committee. And, you know, several of us do, so that helps sort of weed through these bills, but several don't. And so it's up to those of us who sort of have that lived experience to help everyone understand the real impact on the private sector.
Yeah. So, Josh, anything you want to ask here?
I just, Delegate, what are you hearing right now from your constituents? What's, as folks are right coming, the vaccines are starting. I'm sure you're hearing a lot, but just in terms of at the moment, what's the pulse right now?
The biggest topics in the past year, and particularly now, have been unemployment insurance, people who are entitled to unemployment insurance in one way or another, either through the federal program or the state program, and that have struggled with the state system in order to have their cases adjudicated and resolved. That has been the number one problem. That's why we have a big focus in Economic Matters with 5 different bills to try to fix the unemployment system. And it's really just been I would say, a lack of investment in the infrastructure that's led to the unemployment division not being able to handle the onslaught of the number of claims. So that's been something we have been helping people with from day one of the pandemic, and it's ongoing. The second thing we're hearing most about is the vaccines. And, the state is woefully behind other states in being able to distribute and get the vaccines and the shots in arms. And we've had a disagreement with the governor about health departments. Many of us feel that the health departments should be getting, or should have gotten in the beginning, more doses than they did because they were able to reach the vulnerable populations, the 75 and up. Mm-hmm. The governor decided to do a diffuse distribution, which I think makes sense when we have a lot of vaccine, so we can get it out to as many people. But the real problem has been the 75 up population hasn't been able to navigate that system through the internet, through the multiple places to sign up, through figuring out where to go. And so that population's really been left out, which is our most vulnerable and our most important population to vaccinate. So that's been a dilemma that we have been trying to manage since the beginning. So we get an awful lot of questions about the vaccine and how people can get it. And that's, of course, really dependent on the governor and how he rolls out the vaccine system. And so it will improve as we get more, and just heard that the J&J vaccine was approved, so that is good. It will improve, and with a little patience, we'll be able to get it out to everyone, but that has been the number one concern. I mean, I know you want me to say it's something about business, but it hasn't been. It's been the vaccine and unemployment insurance.
Well, no, I mean, I think those two make sense, and especially, and even the unemployment insurance, that issue in and of itself, has certainly been both a business and I guess constituent issue from the standpoint that obviously if you've been impacted, unfortunately, from your job being eliminated, you've got that concern. But then as you touched on it with the unemployment insurance fund and the cost of that's been for many businesses, the concern there. And obviously on the vaccine, I mean, I know that's a conversation we've had personally at home, just particularly wondering about those that don't have, the elderly that maybe not have access to internet, right, and so forth, and just that whole challenge of trying to navigate and so forth. So just one question that did come through actually via the chat from online, and this actually goes back to something we talked about earlier in the sense of the testimonies. And this person was saying that they were hearing, I guess, anecdotally, that the testimonies that were being screened, or at least it says you're being screened or selected heavily for perhaps pro testimonies as opposed to maybe, I guess, opposition testimonies. And
I understand where that assumption is coming from, but let me just put that to rest.
Yes.
One of the bills I think you guys testified on, I think we might have gotten a note from one of you that said there were 30 slots for the proponents, but only 20 for the opponents. The reason that happened is the House policy from the beginning has been 50 people can testify, but not more than 30 for either one side. So what happened was the proponents got in there faster and they took up 30 slots. So
interesting.
It wasn't on purpose. It was just the way they set the rules up because they wanted to keep it even. I guess they could have said no more than 25 for each side, but they said 30, and I don't know the reasoning behind that, but that's why that happened, and it wasn't intentional or purposeful for that particular bill or any particular bill.
Right. No, but that's good to know. I mean, because I think one, just not even knowing that they were kind of, I guess, a limit, and again, the challenge, particularly at this point, with again the kind of everything being uploaded.
I know.
You truly don't know where you fall.
That's right.
And that window. And I think if anything, probably something that from a business standpoint, we've continued to try to, I guess, learn maybe from in many respects, I'll say opponents on certain things, is that certainly some of the grassroots folks tend to move much faster and swifter. And so,
that is, if we had to do this again next year, I think we would make adjustments as we've all learned, a little bit about it.
Yeah. So we are actually here at kind of the end of our time. I know we could talk further, but there's work to be done on a number of fronts. But certainly want to thank you for joining us this morning, and it's been great to have this conversation, and particularly to learn, I think, more of some of the little nuances that are taking place. Because again, I think a lot of times people make comments based upon obviously the optics and the lens that they see, and maybe not always have some of the inside information. So thank you for sharing.
Yes, and I'm available to anyone who has questions. You can email. The best thing to do is to email our office, and we can set up a time to have a conversation via Zoom or phone on any issue that you're concerned about. And we also read all of our emails, so make sure if you have an opinion about something, you send it in.
I can definitely say that for sure. Josh, any closing comments you'd like to add?
No, Delegate Watson, thanks so much for being here this morning. And I just want to give a shout out to your staff. You do have great staff that they respond very promptly.
Thank you. Terry Chaconis is our chief of staff. She does a great job.
Yep, I can definitely say that. And for those, again, that have found this of interest, so next week, we'll actually be starting a little bit later, as we'll have with us Senator Guy Gazzoni. And so we'll get a chance to kind of shift gears and go from the House. I think outside of when we had maybe when we had Senator Lamb and Senator Hester within the first couple of weeks, obviously we haven't had much discussion on the Senate side. And so certainly invite you to join us back here next week. And with that, thank you all for joining us, and have a great week and great rest of your day.
Thank you. Great to be with you.